If you are deeply in love with a person, that makes sense. But for most of us, it doesn't. And so because of the conventions of the medium, when you're on Zoom, you feel like you got to look at the speaker in the eye, and everyone's doing that. And basically, we just wear ourselves out by staring.
Isn't that the truth? All right, so if everyone doesn't mind, go ahead and you can turn off your video and mute your audio so we don't have a lot of feedback from the audience members. That would be really appreciated. If you want to, go ahead and open up the chat bar. We're going to use the chat to communicate, since we have over 70 people on the webinar right now, and more to come. Feel free to type in where you're calling in from. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it may be where you are. During the program here today, if you have any questions for Chris, feel free to just jot them down in the chat bar. We'll be monitoring that as we go along. During Chris's comments or after, we'll be sure to address those. So that'll be our function for a Q&A. Seemed to work okay in the past, so we'll keep doing that. There we go. So we got Timo calling in from Tallinn. That's probably the furthest one away. We have one of our friends from Vienna. That may be Nick, someone that we're working with later this year. We're working on this really program with Austrian startups as well. So glad you're in there. Oakland, Alameda, some locals, wonderful. Danville, love it. Okay. Good morning, y'all. Someone from Texas, must be. All right, great. So let's go ahead and get started then. It's 10:08. We're probably going to wrap up right around 11 o'clock, so we'll stay on schedule. So my name is Nick Schrammick. I'm the Director of International Relations at Silicon Valley Forum, and this is our fourth and final webinar in the Chris Yeh series. So the first webinar we did was focusing on anatomy of a successful pitch, and then we went to one about crafting the perfect story. And then the third one was about finding the right team. And lastly, we're working on scaling. And of course, Chris Yeh, author of Blitzscaling, is the man for the job for this topic for sure. So in case you don't know too much about what we do at Silicon Valley Forum, we connect the world to Silicon Valley, to the ideas, the people, the companies, the innovations that come out of the region. And we do that through programs right now, obviously virtual programs, but regularly we do programs in Silicon Valley and around the world, mentorship for startups, working with governments, corporates as well. So Denise is our executive director here at Silicon Valley Forum, and do you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for being with us today. I just have a very quick announcement to make before we begin. And I should have made this announcement a few times ago, but want to make this today. It's just to say that we are proud to have merged with the SVO earlier this year. They are formerly known as the San Jose Silicon Valley Chamber of Commerce, and they share our commitment to the business and startup community. They're also a convener of leaders and influencers, a catalyst for business growth, and a champion for a stronger community. They also organize many events that would be of interest to you, so I really encourage you to check those out and find out more about the SVO at their website at thesvo.com. To learn more about Silicon Valley Forum initiatives, please visit us at siliconvalleyforum.com, or feel free to email me directly with any questions you might have about either organization at denise@siliconvalleyforum.com. I will also put all this in the chat box as a reminder. So that's
Great.
my announcement for the day. So back to you, Nick.
All right, thanks a lot, Denise, really appreciate it. And even though this is our last of the Chris Yeh series, do note that we have a number of free webinars coming up throughout the summer as we continue to shelter in place. We are committed to providing great content for our community. We're having a series of webinars focused on the role of women in technology as part of that series. We have a few startups coming, or a few webinars coming up on what's happening in agriculture technology as well, and quite a few different topics. So feel free to connect with us on social media to stay up to date on what we're doing. And with that, let's go ahead and turn over to Chris. So Chris Yeh is the co-author of Blitzscaling, which is an appropriate book to read in advance of this webinar. If you haven't yet, I definitely recommend picking it up afterwards. Available at all your online purveyors of books, including Amazon, I am 100% sure. He is also an entrepreneur, an investor, a mentor, and a friend of Silicon Valley Forum and now the SVO. So Chris, we're delighted to have you here for the last of our series, and I'll let you go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much, Denise. And again, it has been a pleasure to be a part of this. As I mentioned earlier, it's extremely helpful to me to have that regular dose of audience. So I'm glad to have you guys here with me today. So we're going to try to make the most out of this finale. So I'm going to talk about scaling, and I'll probably do that until 10:45 or so. I want to make sure you guys have plenty of time to ask your questions. When you ask your questions, don't feel obligated that the questions have to be purely about scaling. They could be about anything. For example, Karen just asked, where are you, Chris? And the answer is, I'm in Palo Alto, California, but I have a virtual background that is from the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So it actually includes a very famous Picasso in the background, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And I do want to emphasize, I do not actually have an original Picasso in my house. In fact, this isn't my house at all. This is just the background. But I do think it looks nice. And I do enjoy adding a note of artistic flair to all of these different things. I have one which is also the Mona Lisa because, you know, of course, I have one of those in my collection as well. So let's talk about scaling. So we've been going along in the course of this series of webinars, starting from the beginning, the pitch, the idea, forming the team, getting people on your side. But let's say you get to the point where all of a sudden things are going your way. And interestingly enough, this has happened to a number of different companies during this pandemic. I have got companies that I've worked with where revenues decline 95% because they're travel companies. And then I have other companies where revenues increased 100% or 200% or 300% because what they do is so spot on for the moment, because they're largely competing with in-person competitors in a traditional industry, and all of a sudden the online way is the only way to do things. So for whatever reason, when you achieve that point where you're getting to scale, you may think to yourself, great, you know, I managed to do it. We got to scale. We're growing fast. Now everything's downhill from here. But unfortunately, the case is that the challenges just keep coming when you're scaling. And while they're high-class problems to have, everyone wants to get to the point where their company is expanding at an enormous rate. It still is a challenge to meet those requirements and to make the changes that are necessary. So let's talk a little bit about some of the changes that you need to make and how to think about it. So if you look at the book Blitzscaling, one of the things we do is we actually talk about how there are different levels of scale. And we divide up these levels of scale based on the size of the organization. The reason we do that, instead of looking at revenues or looking at customers or looking at user base, is that for you, the leader, the size of the organization is really the thing that determines what changes on a day-to-day basis. Running a 10-person organization is radically different from running a 100-person organization, and that's radically different from running a 1,000-person organization. And so we actually do a powers of 10 continuum of sizes and stages, beginning with what we call the family stage, which is about 1 to 9 employees, then going to the tribe, which is 10 to 99, the village, which is 100 to 999, the city, which is 1,000 plus, and the nation, which is 10,000 plus. And for those of you who ever run an organization of size, you know that as the company grows through those stages, it actually changes fundamentally and completely. One of the reasons we outline these stages in Blitzscaling is in Blitzscaling, you may be going through multiple stages in a single year. Right? A company might grow from 10 employees to 1,000 employees in a single year, and that is an enormous strain. Even in a regular sort of startup environment, you might be growing through one of these stages every couple of years. And even though you can adapt to them, you still need to recognize and step back, because you can get caught up in the day-to-day. You may not realize that the character of your company is fundamentally changed. So in thinking about these stages, there are a couple things I want you guys to keep in mind as entrepreneurs. The first is that there is going to be a change in how you run the company from stage to stage. When we talk about software development, for example, people will talk about refactoring. As the application grows, as they do new releases, they refactor. They make sure, well, it worked at this level, but it didn't work at this level. The same applies to organizations. The processes, the policies, the way you do things may change quite a bit over the years. And that means that you are going to have to actively understand that your job isn't done when you set down a set of rules. You're constantly remaking those rules. The analogy that my co-author Reid Hoffman and I like to use is that each different stage is like playing a different game. So maybe you like chess, maybe you like checkers, maybe you like Monopoly, maybe you like Risk, maybe you like Reed, you like Settlers of Catan. Regardless, those are all very different games. And attempting to use the same strategy to win at chess that you do at checkers not only is nonsensical, but is likely to be disastrous. And so in order to be a good leader, you have to recognize that the game is changing with each stage, and then really set out to learn the new rules of each stage. They're going to be different from industry to industry and from company to company. And so what's really necessary is to have what we call an infinite learning mindset, to constantly be experimenting and trying to figure out what's changed without making that assumption, which far too many of us make, that whatever happens in the future is just going to be an extension or projection of what happens to today. Now, this is especially difficult when you're making the transition from the tribe stage to the village stage. So you may recall the tribe stage is about 10 to 99 employees, and the village stage is 100 to 999. Now, the reason that transition is so particularly difficult is because you're making the transition from informal to formal culture. So if you think about how you get started with your team, and I imagine many of you are entrepreneurs, you get started with your team, a group of people, a small group of people in a garage, or in these day and age, because you're bringing your founding team together virtually in a Zoom room where everyone actually fits onto one screen and you can see their faces pretty well. It's pretty informal. And the communications mechanisms are informal as well. You know, if you have a 3-person company, do you really need to do an all hands meeting, or is that just every time you guys are sitting together? And so as a result, you basically rely on just personal relationships, your one-on-one interactions. But as your company grows, it gets to the point where it's almost 100 people. That's obviously not going to be possible. You don't have enough time in the day to do this. And so you're transitioning from that informal, unstructured world to a formal, structured world where you have hierarchy, where you have processes, where you have policies. And this is a really tough change for a lot of people. I personally have always told people, you know what, I prefer companies when they're less than 20 employees. That just feels like the best size to me. That's a size that I actually enjoy. That's very informal. There's a lot of personal relationships. That's just a personal preference. And by the way, you cannot do that much in this world with just a company of 20 employees. There are rare exceptions. Instagram, for example, achieved its first 100 million users essentially with 6 employees. So that's a pretty notable exception. WhatsApp got to its massive size upon acquisition, had 40 employees. But these are pretty rare exceptions. And obviously, we all wish we could have founded Instagram, or we all wish we could have founded WhatsApp, because those were incredible outcomes. So as you are making that transition, what you need to also recognize is the following. A lot of times people then say, wow, okay, if we're going to have a formal culture, let me go out and get some business best practices. And so that may mean going out, like, let me see what Harvard Business Review says. Now, I'm a fan of Harvard Business Review. It's a great publication. I've been published in Harvard Business Review. But I just want to point out that most of the articles in Harvard Business Review are aimed at larger established companies. And the processes and the policies and the programs they have may not be appropriate for your 20-person company. And so as a result, you can't necessarily just rely on what you read as best practices. You have to actively experiment and see what makes sense. So if you are taking this into account, if you are framing this from a learning mindset, the question becomes the classic one that Jeff Bezos asked. Jeff Bezos, of course, is the richest man in the world, the founder and CEO of Amazon, and somebody who has been probably our greatest living business person. If you think about like who's alive today, you know, and active, Bill Gates, I think, would certainly qualify, but he's essentially retired from business for quite some time. It's probably either Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, depending on your tastes in Twitter accounts. Well, Jeff Bezos has said something very simple. He says, you know, a lot of people focus on what's going to be different in 10 years. What I want to focus on instead is the question, what's going to be the same in 10 years? What are the things that we know are still going to be true? And let's focus on those things that are going to continue to be true rather than speculating on what's not going to be true. And what is going to be true are a couple of things. When you are growing your company, in order to actually make it work, you have to ask yourself, what is the way I'm going to manage this organization? And there are a couple of different ways. And the different way, there are a couple of different ways, and the best way is going to become apparent after I go through them. So way number one to manage an organization is dictatorship, right? We've seen it, but we've seen it in a number of organizations. Sometimes there'll be a family-owned business or something like that. There's a founder, their word is law. And the advantage of this is it's very clear who's making decisions. The disadvantage is how can that one person make all the decisions that are necessary? And how do the people underneath the dictator feel about the situation? The second approach is bureaucracy. And bureaucracy basically says, instead of saying, okay, what should I do? Let me ask someone. It's, what should I do? Let me go find the rule. And with bureaucracy, you set up rule after rule after rule in order to cover all the different eventualities. Now, bureaucracy can work, but its big vulnerability is it's very, it's remarkably inflexible. And there's a great story about this from Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix. He ran a company called Pure Software, which became Pure Atria, which was eventually acquired by Mercury Interactive. Very successful outcome. It meant that he was wealthy and successful long before he started Netflix. But he said that his approach at Pure was whenever something went wrong, they made a rule to keep that from ever happening again. And pretty soon they had so many rules that they couldn't actually do anything. And that inflexibility was something he decided he would have to combat when he started Netflix. And that brings us to the third way of managing an organization. And that's the way that ultimately is probably going to be most successful for you. And that's with culture. So there are a lot of things that people say about culture. The most important thing is to first define it. So if you guys have any thought, you may have a definition of culture in your mind. In my mind, culture is defined as the way that things are done around here. In other words, that encompasses the values that people have. It encompasses the implicit rules on behavior, the guiding principles. And the main difference between culture and bureaucracy is that instead of culture being a set of specific rules, it's more that set of guiding principles. It's a set of North Stars, if you will, that people can turn to. And the reason culture is so powerful is it means that you don't have to be in the room in order for people to make the right decision. Now, it is not the same thing as having a direct rule. It is not the same thing as making the decision yourself. Because even in a culture which reflects your values, people are going to make different decisions. There's no way that 100 people with different backgrounds and different experiences will come up with the same decision, even if they're all following the same general principles. So you have to do a little bit of letting go in order to allow the culture to actually work. But when culture works, it's enormously powerful because it actually is the decentralized way of coordinating and directing the action. So let's talk about culture for a second. How does culture work? How do you make culture work in a positive way? Because one of the interesting things we talk about in blitzscaling is the fact that culture is not necessarily good or bad. It simply is. And there are strong cultures and weak cultures, but there could be strong bad cultures, however you want to define that, and there could be strong good cultures. So the thing that we say about culture is if you want to scale, you need to have a strong culture. And it is easier to scale a strong bad culture than it is to scale a weak good culture, because the weakness of the culture prevents it from coordinating and managing the activities. Now, I don't want you to build bad cultures, but I'm going to give you some guidelines on how to avoid that. So the way we think about culture is the way culture interacts with two other key things. I'm going to call these the 3 C's. So culture is the first C. You've heard about that. But culture alone is not enough. As you've heard, there can be bad cultures. The better word for a bad culture is a cult. Think about the various cults that exist. The cults that are out there brainwashing or otherwise causing harm to the world. Those are extremely strong cultures. The people who belong to those cults, like the Manson family, they had a very strong culture that guided their actions. That didn't make it a good culture. It didn't make it a good way to actually build the organization. So the 3 C's actually work together. You have the culture. You also have the Credo. And the Credo is, what are the principles? What are the beliefs? What is the mission of the organization? In the 1980s, there was a very famous business leader named Jim Burke who led Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson, of course, is one of the storied companies in the history of American capitalism, one of the most well-respected and well-regarded companies. And Jim Burke was a business hero in the 1980s because of the way he handled a particular crisis that occurred. That crisis was the poisoned Tylenol capsules. So Tylenol had these capsules. You've all taken Tylenol before. At the time, they had little capsules that allowed you to take your Tylenol and cure your headache. But some madman or woman went around and tampered with Tylenol on the shelves, actually injected them with cyanide. And people bought the Tylenol, went home, took it, and died. So Johnson & Johnson's premier product was poisoned. And the question was, what should they do about it? And what Jim Burke did is he fell back upon what was the Credo in Johnson & Johnson, which is to make people better, to make people healthier, to help everyone be healthy. Well, obviously, poison is not going to help with that. And so he made the difficult decision to immediately pull every single bottle of Tylenol off the shelves. Again, remember, this is their top-selling product. It is one of the iconic brands in America. And they pulled all the bottles off the shelves until they were able to then reformulate and come up with tamper-proof bottles. And that's why Tylenol, by the way, no longer comes in capsules and why it comes with those sealed little metal foil things. It's because of the fact that people wanted to make sure that people could no longer tamper with and poison the medication. And Tylenol was able to then come back with the reformulated caplets instead of capsules and with the re-engineered bottles that were tamper-resistant. And as a result of that, they got back on the shelves, and within a year, Tylenol sales were back to 85% of what they had been before. And within 2 years, they had completely recovered. But this was an example not of Jim Burke saying, you know what, I believe that our sales will recover most quickly if we pull things off our shelves and maintain their trust. This was a case of Jim Burke saying, our credo is that we help people, that we make them healthy. And in order to meet our credo, we have to pull this product off the shelves. And the Credo at Johnson & Johnson is actually something he rewrote when he first arrived there before this ever happened. And he made sure it was on the wall and made sure everyone knew about it. So now we can think about culture and Credo. When you have culture and Credo working together, all of a sudden, instead of just being bound together as a tribe, which could be an angry tribe or a positive tribe, now you have a tribe of people who are bound together by a common mission and a set of values. And that combination of culture and Credo is something that prevents it from just being a cult. And that'll become apparent when I talk about the third C. And this is something that you as entrepreneurs, this really falls upon you. And the third C, and the third C in the triangle, is charisma. So you guys probably hear about charisma a lot. And you can probably name people who are charismatic. So for example, you might think of a president of the United States like Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan as somebody who had great charisma. You might think of a celebrity, an actor like Tom Hanks or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson as somebody who has charisma. And those are all different visions of charisma that basically boil down to, is this person capable of speaking well? Are they handsome? Are they compelling? These are all different forms of charisma. But I'll let you in on a secret. There's actually a way to define charisma that is super clear and is something that you can now take with you and ask yourself, is somebody actually charismatic or not? And the key question about charisma is, does that person have the ability to form an emotional relationship with the people in the audience or the people they're interacting with? It's all about the emotional relationship. Charisma is not rational. It's emotional. It's about feelings. And the way charisma manifests itself in business, if you're a charismatic business leader, what you're able to do is the following. You're able to take what is an economic relationship, employees who work for you because you pay them money, and you turn it into a social relationship. I've been recording a series of podcasts with my old friend and professor, Richard Tedlow of the Harvard Business School, where we talk about these charismatic leaders. You can find these podcasts just by Googling the Chris Yeh podcast. And you can find it, subscribe to on Apple or any other place that you happen to listen to it. And we talk a lot about charisma. What we say is the following. The great charismatic business leaders take the economic relationship, I pay you, you work for me, and turn it into a social relationship. You work for me, and you do the best work of your life, and you help contribute to an important goal. And of course, the patron saint of charismatic business leadership is Steve Jobs. And many of you have probably heard the famous story of how Steve Jobs recruited John Sculley from PepsiCo to Apple. John Sculley was the president of PepsiCo, was being paid a colossal amount of money, was a huge figure in American business, and he gave that up to join Apple. And he gave that up because Steve Jobs went to him. They talked about the Apple opportunity. And Steve Jobs, as he'll do, as he was finishing up, simply said, do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugar water, or do you want to change the world? Now, that Steve Jobs wasn't arguing, hey, you know what, John, you'll make more money at Apple because we're a fast-growing company. You'll get equity that you won't be able to get at PepsiCo, and this is going to make you rich. His argument was, do you want to change the world? And whether that actually paid off, and whether Sculley actually changed the world, I mean, you could argue Sculley failed, and Steve Jobs was the one who ultimately changed the world after he returned as CEO. But the fact is, that is what appealed to Sculley. And that is what appealed to countless Apple employees. You guys have probably read some of the books and heard the stories about Steve Jobs. He wasn't an easy person to work with. He could be abusive. He could be verbally and emotionally abusive. He would tell people that what they did was crap and that they should be ashamed of themselves. But people put up with it because they felt that in working with him, and you can see this in the reminiscences of these various employees, even the ones where it ended acrimoniously, I did the best work of my life when I worked for him. I had the biggest impact on the world. We may want to mute that one. Sorry about that, folks. So let's think about how these three C's now interact. We have the culture, the credo, and the charisma. And if you're the leader, as you scale your company, all three of these end up being scalable, but in different ways. The culture is important because the culture, as now I'll get to the, yes, we should definitely somebody, I just saw a comment come past about Google's Credo, and we'll definitely discuss that in the question and answer session. The culture is the thing that allows you to scale behavior, right? Culture is is basically the force, if you will, that weaves through all the living things in your organization, and the culture guides them in their actions. And so that's really critical for the scalability as you go from family to tribe to village to city to nation. When you get to the nation level, the culture is the main thing that controls things. Rules are no longer going to be able to do that. And so culture is a really critical part of it. But culture alone is not enough. Culture without credo is simply a cult. And so you have to have the credo there. You have to have that mission, that vision of values that are really fundamentally important to the organization. And by the way, that credo is a huge part of how the charismatic leader is able to use their charisma to convert the economic relationship into a social relationship. All three of these factors work together to do that. The culture is the social relationship and fabric between all the employees. The credo is what allows you to say, this is what I believe in. This I believe, which is actually the name of a very famous Edward R. Murrow radio series. And then the charismatic leader is the one who brings us all together. So you can imagine a company with a credo and with a culture. And that credo and culture are powerful, and they will guide people's actions and they will hold them together. But it takes that charismatic leader to inspire them to greater efforts, to get them to reach down deep and do more than they ever thought they could before. But a charismatic leader alone is not enough. A charismatic leader without a culture, without a credo, that's just a sociopathic dictator. That's a cult leader. And a cult leader, even with charisma and culture, is not enough. You need that credo in order to actually create a positive culture that people are going to believe in, that people are going to voluntarily join and cause them to feel like this is the greatest thing I've done in my life. So for those of you who are entrepreneurs, you may be asking yourself, what do I do? You know, how do I actually make this happen? How do I become charismatic? And some of you may feel like you're very charismatic. Maybe people are drawn to you. You have a magnetic personality. Other people may say, well, I'm an introvert. I don't like talking to large groups. I'm not comfortable with making rah-rah speeches. My answer to that is that's not what charisma is about. Charisma is about connecting with people and creating an emotional relationship. Let me give you an example of a very different kind of charisma, but one which is just as charismatic and just as successful. Now, I imagine many of you have watched a Pixar movie sometime in your life, right? Everyone has done that, especially now with this pandemic. If you have kids, you probably watched them 350 times in the past couple of months. Pixar's co-founder, and CEO until very recently is Ed Catmull. Now, Ed Catmull is a member of a legendary class of computer scientists at the University of Utah that included people like John Warnock, the founder of Adobe, that included people like Alan Kay, who may be one of the most brilliant computer scientists that ever lived. And Ed led Pixar to enormous success, right? This is a company that had 14 consecutive #1 movies at the box office. It still is the brand when it comes to children's entertainment and basically entertainment for people of all ages. I know I love many of the great Pixar movies, Finding Nemo, Ratatouille. These are phenomenal, phenomenal movies. And Ed Catmull was there for all of that and led them through all of it. Now, if you've ever met Ed, he's a soft-spoken guy. Doesn't yell, doesn't do rah-rah speeches. He's not going to be like Steve Ballmer, if any of you have ever seen the clip of Steve Ballmer on stage shouting, developers, 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 and screaming like a madman. That's not Ed Catmull at all. But he made Pixar a place where the culture and Credo really were there, where people would collaborate, where the focus is on producing something, as in the words of Steve Jobs, insanely great. The movies that they made, many of you are probably familiar with the movie Up. The movie Up began as a story about a prince and a prince and a floating castle. And this prince was going on a quest to rescue, I think, a princess from the floating castle. Now, that is not what the movie Up ended up being about. That is just the seeds of floating in the sky, the word up. And what they did was, as they worked on this story, they realized it wasn't working. And they said, we're going to tear this apart. We're going to start from scratch. We're going to change this movie fundamentally. Same thing held true for Toy Story, for all of these movies along the way. They went through this long gestation period where people went through and worked together. They threw out ideas. People didn't say, well, this is my idea. We got to stick with it. They really collaborated to make that happen. And that was because they had a culture that said, we're going to work together and we're going to share ideas honestly, and we're going to take that feedback into account. And they had a credo, which was, we're going to make great stories. We're going to make and tell great stories. And Ed Catmull didn't have to yell at them or scream at them. He didn't have to give an impassioned Independence Day speech. He simply had to create the environment where that happened and make sure that as things came up, and believe me, there were always challenges at Pixar. No organization is without challenge, no organization is without bumps, that he was able to bring people together to make that happen and to reinforce that credo, to reinforce that culture at every turn. So there are many ways for you to be a charismatic leader. There's many ways for you to run your company as it scales. Don't feel like there's only one model. Once upon a time, Silicon Valley looked to David Packard and Bill Hewlett as their model for management. And Bill and Dave were humble guys. They were known for, not for management by walking around, for holding parties. And basically Hewlett Packard was a place where people were family. Talk more about family. There was a question I saw earlier, especially because I wrote about this extensively in the Alliance. And that was the model for Silicon Valley. And then Steve Jobs came along, and Steve Jobs pursued a very different model of charisma. They were both models of charisma, but Steve Jobs, because of his incredible success, became the model that people began to emulate themselves. You could view Elon Musk as an even more extreme version of Steve Jobs. But this is not the only way to be charismatic. This is not the only way to run a company. And you can see that, for example, in the case of Apple, without the animating genius of Steve Jobs, they've still been able to be successful. They're still one of the world's most valuable companies under a very different form of leadership by Tim Cook. So even the same organization can operate with different forms of leadership. So let's recap, because I know we're getting close to the 10:45 mark. So when it comes to scale, most important things to remember. First of all, as a company scales, it is a change it's a qualitative change, not just a quantitative change. It's a step function change. And that means that you need to have the attitude of, even if we've gotten everything together and we're now scaling and growing, that doesn't mean my job is over. That means my job is just beginning. And my job is, as the company grows, to figure out when we've transitioned into playing a new game, to figure out the new rules of that new game, and then to figure out how we can win at that game. And the only way to do that is to really lean in and be an infinite learner, somebody who's constantly thinking to themselves, you know what worked before won't necessarily work now, and I got to continue to stay alert. Now, those stages, as I described them: family, tribe, village, city, nation. The biggest transition is between the tribe and village stages, because you're going from informal to formal. And here, don't learn just from Harvard Business Review. Don't just blindly adopt the policies of a Fortune 500 company, because you're not a Fortune 500 company. Instead, look around and find the things that actually work for companies around your size, and talk to the people for whom this has worked before. And ultimately, the guidance that I'm giving you in order to scale your company successfully is to create that triangle, the 3 C's, where you have a culture, a credo, and your own charisma that allows you to create an environment where people are not just going to come to work for a paycheck, but are going to come to work because they believe they can do their best work, and they believe they can have a dent in the universe, where they have a social and emotional relationship, not just an economic relationship. Because human beings, regardless of how economists would like to paint us as purely rational economic actors, are people who are going to feel, who are going to do things based on the moment, the inclination. Most of the time we make decisions emotionally, and then our reason comes in and justifies them afterwards. Well, you know what? I can't turn humanity into robots, but that's okay. Turn around and leverage it by finding your charisma, whether it is the traditional charisma of the great orators and the rah-rah coaches, or whether it's the quiet charisma of just somebody who knows how to reinforce the culture and how to live up to the credo. So I'm glad that you guys have been with me through this 4-month process of talking about scaling up companies. I hope that you've gotten a lot out of it. I know that I certainly have. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions. I saw a vast pile of questions already come in. Nick, what is the best way to handle the question and answer session here?
Either way, you can pick and choose which ones really strike your fancy. I could choose which ones I find of interest. It's really up to you. We got 15 minutes.
All right.
Here. So,
wow. So yeah, let me just go ahead and I'll just start straight up, and everyone keep asking questions in the chat. I'm just going to go in chronological order, because that's just simple and easy, and hopefully I won't run out of time. So the first question was from Gabriel, which is a great question. Google had the credo, don't be evil, and then I believe it no longer explicitly espouses this credo. Yes, in fact, they got rid of it. What does that tell you? Some employees at Google have pushed back against their employers on contracts with governments they find doing objectionable things, including the US government, by the way. Mm-hmm. What happens when the credo conflicts with the bottom line? It seems like a counterexample to the Johnson & Johnson case. So this is the key thing. And I find it so ironic that you have Google and Facebook as companies where, they're taking actions which you and I might view negatively because they're focusing on the bottom line instead of on a set of principles. And I find it ironic because these are the most profitable companies in the world. If any company could afford to make decisions based on principle instead of economics, it's these companies. They have virtual monopolies. They're incredible businesses. And by the way, the founders of those companies hold super voting shares that mean that they could do anything. If Mark Zuckerberg wanted to take Facebook and say, we're shutting down the website, we're turning it into a fast food restaurant, there's nothing the shareholders or board members could do about it. He has total and complete control. So the fact that these companies choose not to live up to their principles when they're the ones who are most capable of doing it is really dismaying and dispiriting. So I will tell you what I want you to do, which is to not behave like Google and not behave like Facebook. What I want you to do is to understand that that is what principle is about. So oftentimes people argue for things that are good in principle with the argument, it's better for business. And that may very well be true, because I think it's better for business in the long run not to be hated and viewed as a giant Bond villain, essentially. But even leaving that aside, do your principles and values matter to you? If they do, you should be willing to sacrifice money in order to live up to them. If we only ever followed principles when they optimize their economic outcome, we don't have principles. We're just purely optimizing our economic outcomes. So if you have principles, live up to them. Don't be like Google. Don't be like Facebook. In Facebook's defense, I would say they never had principles, so it's not like they're turning their backs on them. But Google really has done so. So the next question is, can a family culture and a high-performance culture still exist or coexist? And why was John Chambers successful with the Cisco culture for 25 plus years? So with it is possible to have a high-performance culture and still have it be compassionate. And by high-performance culture, what I mean is a culture that values performance and does not tolerate poor performance. And you can be compassionate under those circumstances. If somebody is not a fit, if they cannot perform, then keeping them in the organization that is not a good fit for them is not compassionate. I mean, if you say, well, this person is not going to perform because they're just simply incompetent, it doesn't seem to me that it's the obligation of the company to then support them forever and harm everyone else at the company who is trying to actually create good performance. Conversely, it is possible to be a high-performance culture and have a terrible kind of culture because you have this approach which is combative, which is dishonest, which is all these different things. So the fact that you emphasize performance does not affect whether or not you have an ethical culture. And I think that, with John Chambers and the Cisco culture, I think that, there are a variety of reasons why Cisco was so successful for so long. A primary one was just riding this incredible wave of the growth of the internet and network effects, in the sense that the Cisco IOS as an operating system and Cisco routers as in operating with each other meant that it was difficult for other people to come in. So there are a lot of strategic reasons why Cisco was so successful for so long. But John Chambers also did a good job of maintaining both a high performance culture, but a culture which was, not considered cutthroat and evil. Right? John Chambers is not Larry Ellison. Not saying that Larry Ellison is cutthroat and evil, but you can read into that what you will. So I think that you can absolutely balance those two. The two are basically orthogonal axes where you can do both. Next question. How important is leadership in developing culture? It is essential if you want to intentionally develop the culture. So cultures will always develop no matter what. They're going to develop. Every company has a culture. It may be a weak culture, it may be a strong culture, it may be a good culture, maybe a bad culture, but there's no such thing as an organization without culture. It's always going to have culture. But leadership is how you shape that culture. Now, it's not like you are Moses coming down from the mountains with stone tablets. What you have to do is you have to actually shape it like a gardener. But the great leaders actually focus on shaping the culture intentionally. And it is essential in developing a good, strong culture. I don't think there's ever the case of a company that's developed a good, strong culture without having a strong leadership. Question, are you able to, from Hari, are you able to comment on the impact a company's business model has on scale? Absolutely. One of the things that you'll find in the book Blitzscaling is a list of growth factors and growth limiters that determine how blitzscalable an organization is. And at the very early stages of your company, you should be looking at your business model and designing it for scalability. And there's things that obviously are going to make a business model more scalable than others. It's how frictionless is the distribution to the end users? What is your gross margin? What is your operational scalability? Are there any network effects that are going to allow your company like Cisco to really dominate your market for decades? And these things are going to dramatically affect your ability to scale your company, as well as to make that scale profitable, make that company profitable at scale. So business model is really essential. And even before you set out, I strongly advise you to, of course, read Blitzscaling, but just in general, think about how scalable your business model is. Now, you're going to have to be really focused on a day-to-day basis and just surviving. That's the nature of startups. But put that time up front before the crush of actually having customers and users and people yelling at you starts to make it hard for you to concentrate. Think very carefully about your business model. Question from Ron: how important are the values associated with the culture? They're essential because the values of the culture are going to be what determines how people behave. And they should be values that you believe in, that you agree with. But recognize that once you have an organization of more than one, not everyone's going to agree. And again, I don't think it's the case that you as the CEO and founder should simply be a dictator, like everything you says goes. You're the final decision maker, but if you always make a decision against the wishes of everyone else, then that's clearly a bad sign. Company's vision sets a company's sense of direction. How do Credo and vision relate? Yes, so vision is more specifically what you're trying to achieve, what kind of end goal you have. Whereas a Credo is more about what's really important to you. And so what's going to happen is you have a vision that you want to achieve, and the Credo is going to shape how you achieve it. The Credo itself is not the end goal. The Credo itself is more the set of principles. Could the changing of principles be a function of scale and maturity? Facebook and Google now look like Microsoft 20 years ago, and Microsoft seems to have taken on a more principled stance. So that is a fascinating hypothesis. I think there is some evidence to that to suggest that's the case. Certainly, behaving in an ethical way is easier when you have a mature and stable business. And I do think that what's interesting is you saw this evolution, not just of Microsoft, but of Bill Gates. I mean, you and I, obviously, since you asked the question, can remember the Bill Gates of 20 years ago being deposed by the Justice Department. It was vilified throughout the technology industry as its greatest villain. And now he's one of our greatest heroes, not just in the technology industry, but globally. So people can grow and change. Steve Jobs, while definitely still abrasive and hard to get along with, was vastly better in his second time around at Apple than in his first time around. People can grow and change, and I sure hope that Facebook and Google do grow and change. A question from Victor. You talked about the founder/leader being charismatic and espousing Credo culture. What's the impact of the board? What's your advice for founders on how to get the right board members for Credo and culture? So you can't really count much on the board members to have that big an impact on the organization. If you're counting on board, I mean, how many people in a company really know who the board members are? It really doesn't make that big a difference. The main thing is to make sure the board are people that the founder will actually listen to and get benefit from. Right? It's not just a bunch of fancy names. It's people who will help the founder and leader do those hard things that are necessary to lead, to establish the Credo and culture, to keep the company true to that Credo and culture. Dylan asks, Zuck is Facebook. Corporations are people, reflection of leadership. So if Facebook chose to be a food chain tomorrow, then they could choose to have one of the more diverse Silicon Valley workforces as a component of the Credo. Absolutely. The reason Facebook doesn't do anything about these things is because Mark Zuckerberg chooses not to do them. And that's something that he has to be convinced. And, I don't know why he hasn't made these decisions. He is really smart. I've only met him in person once, but he's phenomenally intelligent. And I would think he would realize that the behavior that Facebook has tolerated and the approach it has taken is negative in the long run, and that a better long-term approach is for Facebook to promote positivity and harmony as opposed to disharmony and negativity and anger. Joanne says, I find your 3 C's can be distilled into what does a brand stand for based on the Credo, principle, values, culture, the founder's brand DNA. So yeah, you know what? I think that it does make sense. Like the brand can be defined by those 3 C's. So it's a good comment. Chris, how do you hire a good diverse group as opposed to a homogenous group that aligns with the Credo? That's a question from Karen. So it's very important to choose values, principles, things like that in your Credo that are more universal. They don't have to be universal in the sense that everyone agrees with them. If your Credo is something that everyone can agree with, that's not really helpful. A good culture, a good Credo are going to repel some people and attract others. It's all about differentiation. Like not everyone is, when people say hire A players, it's a player for the particular role for that organization. So to hire a good diverse group, it's come up with a Credo that does not inherently drive them away. And to also make sure that as you're hiring people at the beginning, this is one of those things where there's a founder effect. If you're hiring people with diverse networks from the start, they're going to refer other people in. If you hire diverse people from the start, the next person that comes in is going to look at that and say, okay, I feel comfortable being here. how difficult is it to be Jackie Robinson, to be the person who breaks the color line versus to be the second person or the third person? Does anyone remember who the second or third person was? No, we remember Jackie Robinson because it's such an incredibly difficult thing to do. Build in diversity from the start so you don't have to ask someone to be Jackie Robinson. You just have to ask them to join a 5-person team. Question from Hari. It feels like orgs with bad culture are prone to easier disruption. Any truth to that? So they are prone to easier disruption in the sense that they are, badness is often correlated with not being connected to reality, which means that somebody who is more connected to reality is going to be able to more easily come in and disrupt things. We see that playing out in the world of politics as well. Fundamentally, you can only deny reality for so long before reality comes knocking on the door and says, guess what, your bill is due. So that's why cultures with bad organizations are not as effective. But a culture with a strong bad organization is probably going to be more effective than a culture with a weak good organization, weak good culture. The name of the book, Karen, is Blitzscaling, Blitzscaling. You can also look up The Alliance, which is my other book from 2014. And then, I have to take this one. Okay. Victor, great. So glad to have you on. Glad you're here. So I'll speak quickly because I have a meeting at 11 and you guys are also going to come off as well. So the question was, how do the 3 C's work at Theranos? And it's very simple. Theranos was a company where they did not have an actual credo that they lived up to. There was a fake credo, but they didn't live up to it. They built a culture that was essentially a cult. So it really was a charismatic leader focusing on a culture that did not have a set of values. Like think about what Theranos' values were. What Theranos decided to do was to fake its results. And the individual employees lived in terror. It was basically a dictatorship with Elizabeth Holmes and her co-founder, whom they were secretly dating, running everything. So these things failed miserably at Theranos because they were never there. Theranos was essentially a cult, unfortunately. So final thoughts. For those of you who enjoyed this series, you should go to chrisyeh.com, CHRISYEH. You can see it on Zoom. Subscribe to my newsletter. You can also look at my blog and see the various things that I'm talking about. I got to talk this last one. Ron asked a question. This is a good one. What is your view of the predominant Silicon Valley culture of white, liberal, elitist people running the company? So what's interesting is people have to think about diversity not just in terms of race, but also in terms of ideology. So if you think about Silicon Valley, like San Francisco is the most biased place in the country. Only 13% of votes go to Republican candidates. And I think it's very easy for people who are lost in this bubble to think that that is the only way that people see the world. Again, you may disagree with the way other people see the world. That's okay. You have your beliefs, but you should understand that other people don't necessarily share those beliefs. The same thing can happen in the opposite direction. In Provo, Utah, 77% of votes go to Republicans, so they probably don't understand Democrats either. I do think that it would be wise for people in Silicon Valley to get out of their bubble now and then and see how different people think in different regions. And that is an important thing that I would like more people to do. So Nick, I'm turning it back over to you. I'm going to have to take off in a sec, but is there any last thing before I go?
I think that's it, Chris. We'll let you get on to your next meeting. Thank you so much once again. I think someone did drop in the link to your Blitzscaling book if you want to catch up on any of these ideas. Chris, thank you so much for all this and addressing all the questions. Obviously, a lot more to touch on this topic.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
And if people are interested in recordings of this webinar or any of the others in the Chris Yeh series, be sure to go to startupedia.info, which is where they'll be held. Thank you all again and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.